All right, we're going to talk about the carbon cycle today, part one of several. And these carbon cycle lectures are based on a reading. That's on chapter 8 from the book The Earth System. And that book is by Comp et al. It's in its third edition currently. Pages 147 to 154. Okay, so where's our motivation here? Spelled motivation wrong. Motivation, here we go. Okay. Motivation is carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. That's our main motivation. So carbon is a major component of greenhouse gases, not just carbon dioxide. So both CO2 and methane. So these are actually, they're relatively small, in small concentrations in the atmosphere, but they contribute a lot to the greenhouse effect, which we'll be talking about. And another motivation is this carbon is a good example of many other Earth systems. So the carbon cycle is a good example of an Earth system. And so we could talk about the water cycle, nitrogen cycle, phosphorus, etc. So you get a lot of the concepts that we cover here apply to these cycles as well. So back to that motivation. This is a really crucial plot. So scientists have been measuring CO2 concentrations in the Earth's atmosphere in Hawaii, at the top of a volcano, for many decades now. And on this plot, you can see how this sort of inexorable trend up and up, increasingly higher concentrations of carbon dioxide. And also you see here you see annual variations that we'll talk about. So since carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, and the Earth is getting warmer and warmer, it's interesting. The pandemic, 2020, barely a blip, right? Like things slowed down a lot. So this is a beast, and we want to understand how this system works if we want to have any much hope of making effective changes that might slow things down or level that curve off. So we're going to start by imagining the typical path that a carbon atom that's in the atmosphere might experience. So we'll just follow a carbon atom around for a while and see what it experiences, where it goes, etc. So we'll start with an atmospheric CO2 molecule. So we're starting out carbon is this carbon is bonded to oxygen, to two oxygens as a molecule, and we can refer to this molecule CO2 as something called inorganic. It's not really super important for this class, but chemists use this term inorganic and organic. And so by inorganic, basically what we mean, it's not bonded to hydrogen. So it's helpful to sometimes split the carbon cycle between inorganic and organic aspects. So the CO2 is inorganic, is in the atmosphere. It's going to spend something like 10 years in the atmosphere. So obviously some CO2 is going to spend more time, some's going to spend less time, but this is sort of a typical length of time for a carbon atom to be in the atmosphere. And it's going to visit both the north and south hemispheres. So this is important to note. Sometimes students don't realize how well mixed the atmosphere is. So the carbon that we release in New York City, it goes all over the world, in this relatively short amount of time. Kind of like a drop of food coloring in a bucket of water. It spreads out very quickly. So that's one of the reasons that, for example, planting some trees anywhere is going to pull down carbon for the whole planet. There's no need to plant trees in particular places where there's a lot of carbon being emitted. It balances out. It's also interesting that this 10 years is very different from an individual carbon atom, as we'll see, it goes in and out of the atmosphere fairly rapidly, but the overall effect of releasing carbon dioxide into the air is not something that would just dissipate in 10 years if we stopped adding carbon. We see that's more like thousands of years scale that the elevated CO2 levels are there. So we'll talk a little bit more about that again, but just important point is that a typical atom of carbon is in the air for about 10 years. And then this atom that we're following, it's going to passes into a leaf during photosynthesis. So it's daylight. Plant absorbs the carbon dioxide in its leaf, and as part of that photosynthesis process, the oxygen is ripped away, right? The bonds are broken, ripped away, and replaced by nitrogen, hydrogen, and maybe other carbons. So it forms a different molecule. Photosynthesis converts the CO2. So the carbon is now an organic. It's now in an organic carbohydrate molecule. And carbohydrates have the form some amount of carbon times, or in connected to some water, and sometimes there's other elements involved, nitrogen and so forth. but we're going to keep it pretty simple in this class. So I should say carbon is now in an organic carbohydrate molecule. Okay, so it's part of the leaf, right? So winter arrives. The leaf falls to the ground. And the carbon molecule stays on the forest floor for quite a while, around 50 years in this case. It could be less or more. As the leaf decays, turns into soil. And as part of that process, some bacteria decompose. Basically, they eat the carbohydrate. And they release carbon as carbon dioxide again, back into the atmosphere. Okay, and then this cycle, all this, typically happens maybe 500 times. Repeat this 500 times. And then the bit of the leaf falls in a creek. And the carbon atom heads to sea. So the carbon in the leaf is transported down the river, settles to the ocean bottom. Becomes a rock eventually. After millions of years, so notice the change in the time scale. We're going to actually split the carbon cycle into a short-term time scale that sort of revolves around these sort of processes we talked about a few minutes ago, and the longer-term sort of geologic carbon cycle. So after millions of years, heat and pressure metamorphose the rock. And that forms and releases CO2 gas. Comes out a volcano. And then we're back where we started, with CO2 in the atmosphere. So this is just one of many possible examples. And some important points here are how carbon spends time in what we could think of as reservoirs, or in the language of systems, stocks. So the carbon is in sort of the atmospheric reservoir for a period of time. It is in the reservoir of living plants. It transfers to the soil. It's part of the soil for several decades. it spends time as a rock. So these are all places that carbon we could count and measure the carbon in these places, and then we can refer to the flows, which are how the carbon moves from one of these reservoirs to the other. And the other critical point here is how carbon is recycled many times. Okay, so that's why it's the carbon cycle. The carbon isn't just getting used up and buried, and that's the end of it. It comes back, and all right. So let's look at these reservoirs of carbon. So what are the major carbon reservoirs? The stocks, we could say. And we're going to measure these. I'm going to give you some numbers in gigatons, which I'm just going to abbreviate GT. And a gigaton, sounds pretty abstract, but if you can imagine a 1 by 1 by 1 kilometer cube of coal, that's about 1 gigaton. Okay. So we talked about the leaf. So that leaf is an example of biomass. So all the living stuff on the planet, there's about 600 gigatons of carbon in the biomass. And the atmosphere is a similar amount. Around, and this is increasing, but something like 760 gigatons of carbon in the atmosphere. So a similar amount to the biomass. And another reservoir of carbon that we touched on in that example, terrestrial soils and sediments. So terrestrial means on land, in the land, so opposed to in the ocean. So these would be like lake sediments, for example. There's about double the atmospheric CO2 in the soils and sediments. Marine sediments, even more, about double what's in the terrestrial soils and sediments. And for comparison, fossil fuels. So this is the carbon stored in fuel that could be dug up and burnt up. There's about 4,700 gigatons. Okay, so there, you can sort of imagine, all right, if these are the, it dwarfs what's available in the land, in the atmosphere, and in the biomass. So the fossil fuels are really the accumulation of. Let's pause here for a second. So what are fossil fuels? These are basically the stored biomass of deep time. So the geologic record of material that was alive, took carbon out of the atmosphere, and got buried and turned into rock, and eventually oil and gas. Okay, so, but it started as the same the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that plants photosynthesized, just like the biomass that is alive today. Okay, so I found this surprising when I first learned that the oceans contain an enormous amount of carbon, around 39,000 gigatons. So it turns out that a lot of, roughly half of the CO2 that's released when we burn fossil fuels ends up dissolved in the ocean. And we'll talk about that. It's a positive thing for global warming, but it is acidifying the ocean, which is not a good thing for many of the organisms that live in the ocean, or the organisms like us that depend on the ocean to be a functioning source of food, for example. And the last reservoir we'll talk about here is the carbon in sedimentary rocks. And that dwarfs it all, around 50 million gigatons. So some of that, a small portion of that is concentrated enough to be considered fossil fuels, but most of it's pretty spread out in the rocks. And again, that's the carbon that's been pulled out of the atmosphere over the geologic time. There's also a lot of carbon in the mantle, but in terms of the reservoirs that are relevant for the cycle, the rock cycle, the carbon cycles that we'll be talking about, that carbon in the mantle kind of stays there. So we'll leave it out for now. So we want to take a systems approach to this carbon cycle. So we're going to talk about stocks. We're basically going to make a stock flow diagram. Or many of them over the period of the course, for atmospheric carbon. Okay, so we're going to start simple and we'll get more complicated later. So maybe pause for a moment. What is the stock that we would use here? So it's atmospheric CO2, and there's around 760 gigatons, as we just said. Okay, so we'll use our convention of putting a box around the stocks. And then we'll talk about the inflows and the outflows. And we're just going to keep this simple for now. And refer just to what's happening on land, between the atmosphere and the land. So we have an inflow of around 60 gigatons per year. And this comes from the process of respiration and decomposition. And that's roughly balanced by outflow. So we could put our little valve here. Let's do that. So roughly balanced, also about 60 gigatons per year by photosynthesis. Okay, so we're moving with our stock flow diagrams now. We are moving into putting numbers on things, and you'll note that for the flows, those numbers have units of a rate, some amount per time, both in and out. And the stocks themselves are just an amount. And so when we're approaching the cycles as scientists, we want to be very careful with the units, the numbers, and paying attention to the process. So the flows are associated with some process, and we talked about this earlier. The flow, the bacteria turned carbon that was in a carbohydrate molecule. They turned that into CO2 through this decomposition process. It's the same process that animals are doing when we do respiration. And on the other side, it's the photosynthesis process that controls how much CO2 comes out of the atmosphere for the sort of terrestrial world. There's different processes. We could add transfers from the ocean or fossil fuels and other things like that. But for now, we're just kind of keeping it really simple. Right. So in this diagram, if we turned the sun off, the outflow would stop, right? And we could calculate how quickly CO2 in the atmosphere would go up. So that's the kind of thing that scientists are doing when they're making models of future climate or the past climate, is trying to understand all these different processes that are happening, and so that we can predict like how fast they're going to occur, what would happen if different, if it gets warmer or cooler, that sort of thing. Okay, so we can define something called steady state using this diagram. So steady state is what it sounds like. It's when inflow equals outflow. So in this case, the inflow equals the outflow, so we consider this a steady state. We expect the atmospheric CO2 to stay at the same level. Steady state depends on the time span considered. So, we saw that example earlier from the Hawaii volcano. We had these annual perturbations. If we zoom out a couple years, we're at a relatively a steady state. But if you looked at just like a month, you would see that it's not a steady state. So it's we want to maybe reference how much time we're talking about when we're referring to steady state or not. And those seasonal fluctuations they send carbon dioxide up and down around 5 parts per million. And so this is a different unit than the gigatons, but they're the same order of magnitude. So differ by about a factor of 2. Okay. So atmospheric carbon dioxide is affected by various feedbacks. So one of those I'll draw out. So CO2 concentration. The more carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere, the easier it is for plants to photosynthesize. So more carbon dioxide, more photosynthesis. So we add a positive to this arrow. And it's a feedback, so of course there's going to be arrow like this. So let's think about this for a moment. So the more photosynthesis that happens, is that going to be a positive or negative effect on carbon dioxide concentration? So recall, right, photosynthesis is using the atmospheric CO2 and turning it into biomass. So the more photosynthesis we have, the less CO2. I should clear this up. Atmospheric CO2 concentration, right? So overall, this is a negative balancing. It's a negative feedback. It's a balancing feedback. And we'll be talking about more of these sort of different feedbacks in the systems. So another important definition we can make here is something called residence time. So the question is, how long does carbon stay in the atmosphere? Okay, so I just dropped a number earlier, 10 years or so. So where is that number coming from? It's coming from this calculation, residence time equals the reservoir size when you're at steady state, or close to it, divided by either the inflow or outflow rate. Okay, so if you think about this for a moment, the units were gigatons, and then for the reservoir here, and then the flows were in gigatons per year. So the units are going to be in years. So it's a time scale, like we would expect for something called the residence time. All right, and so we could do that with the numbers we have above. So we have 760 gigatons divided by either inflow or outflow. They're the same, gigatons per year. And that gives us a value around 13 years. I just simplified that as 10 earlier. So the residence time of CO2 in the atmosphere, we could calculate different residence times, for the CO2 in the biomass or the soil, for example. We need to know the size of the reservoirs, which we listed out earlier, and the rates. So let's look at the short-term terrestrial organic carbon cycle in more detail. Okay, so we're not going to go into geologic processes. We're going to stay out of the ocean. We're going to talk about the interactions between plants and animals and this sort of thing. And the numbers that are going to be on here are in gigatons or gigatons per year. So we're going to make some space in your paper. We're going to create a kind of large stock flow diagram, and we're going to start where we did before, but we're going to just consider it sort of a lot more of the important parts of it. So we have the atmospheric CO2, and we've said that has a size around 760 gigatons. And let's just put in the processes that we talked about before. So the way that carbon dioxide leaves the atmosphere that we've talked about was photosynthesis. So photosynthesis takes carbon from the atmosphere and it transfers it to what we call primary producers. Okay, and this reservoir of primary producers has a a size of around 600 gigatons. So this is the photosynthesizing organisms. So some plants and algae and things like that can do photosynthesis. And we'll talk about, unfortunately, we have this term primary producers or primary production. The process, so we have a flow here. We've already said that the rate that this happens, photosynthesis, is around 60 gigatons per year. And we want to label what that process is. Okay, and in our little example of the leaf, we had the carbon was decomposed. So another option is for the carbon to be eaten, right? So if I eat some lettuce, I transfer that carbon into my body, and I'm what's called a consumer in the science, in the carbon cycle sort of vernacular. And you'll notice there's way more 100 times more mass of carbon in plants than in animals, which makes sense if you just kind of look around in the world. There's quite a bit more trees and grasses and so forth than there are consumers. Okay, so that process is called basically eating, we could call it feeding, and it occurs at a rate about 30 gigatons per year. So you can see when you add these units, you can see that we're missing something here, right? So this is the example of what we're missing here is right when the leaf fell off the tree and entered the soil, right? That process. So let's call that death. And turns out that happens at a rate of around 30 gigatons per year. So now the rates, we want to check that these diagrams are in balance, right? So if the numbers don't add up in terms of the ins and outs, we know that something's off with the diagram. We're missing something, okay? So death is going to take that carbon that's in the carbohydrates and put it into the soil and sediments. And the size of that reservoir around 1600. So we can scroll back up here, right? You can see we're going through a lot of these reservoirs that we mentioned earlier, terrestrial soils and sediments. Okay, but now with the stock flow diagram, we're making this into a system that we could actually calculate different things. Calculate residence times. We could model this system. Okay, so consumers also eventually die, right? And they end up in the soil and sediments. But that this process is actually negligible. There's not enough. Not enough to really count in terms of the numbers that we're using in this diagram. So where does most of that carbon that ends up in you and me go? It ends up back in the air, right, through the process of respiration. And as we saw earlier, that has a rate of around 60, which balances the photosynthesis. You know what? I think there's a mistake here I'm noticing. Right, we put 30 in, but we're taking 60 out. This is wrong. This is wrong, right? This should be 30. Thank you. This is what happens when you keep track of units. It's a good example of not units, but quantifying things, right? I wouldn't have noticed that if it weren't for the numbers in checking that things are adding up. Okay. So before we go too much further, let's define. Let's just write out what primary producers are, because that term we're going to see again. So, primary productivity. Is it organic matter produced by photosynthesis per time per area? Okay, so where are things not balanced? This area, right? We're putting 30 gigatons per year into the soil and sediments as the primary producers die, but we're not showing anything coming out. So what we're missing here is, right, in the example of a carbon atom, the bacteria did. There was a process of decay where that carbon is converted back into the atmosphere. So decomposition is missing here. And it turns out there's actually two decomposition paths. And one of them involves the carbon ends up spending some time as methane. There's about 10 gigatons a year of methane gas, 10 gigatons total methane gas in the atmosphere. And then that methane eventually breaks down by a process called methane oxidation at a rate of around 0.5 gigatons per year. And the type of decay that produces methane is called anaerobic. So without oxygen, that's what that means. And that happens at around half a gigaton a year also. Most of the decay, though, however, occurs by what's called aerobic respiration. Aerobic decomposition, right? So both of these paths from soil and sediments into the atmosphere are decomposition paths. We have sometimes that happening without oxygen and sometimes with. So most of it is involving oxygen, which is why the carbon is turned into CO2. So we're adding the CO2 to it. So obviously it's aerobic, has oxygen. We could also decompose the carbohydrate and turn it into methane, which doesn't have oxygen in it. The molecule doesn't have oxygen. But then it breaks down in the atmosphere because there's so much oxygen in the atmosphere, it turns into CO2. And we could calculate from this diagram the residence time of methane in the atmosphere, right? It would be 10 divided by 0.5. So this process, let's just define oxidation, since that term is being used. So oxidation is combining an atom with oxygen, and that always involves making, maybe not always, but usually, a more inert compound. So this is like rust or CO2. And that's a process that releases energy. So that's why we eat plants, us animals, right? So we can use that energy by performing this chemical reaction. And then that stuff we make, the CO2, or isn't so reactive anymore, because there's not so much energy in it. Okay, so I think if you inspect this diagram, you see that it balances now. We have soil and sediment. We have 30 coming in. We have 30 coming out. The 30, we split the primary producers in half. Half of them getting eaten. Half of it per year getting, ending up in the soil or sediments. But notice the different sizes of these reservoirs, right? The consumer reservoir is much smaller than the soil and sediment. So where does carbon spend more time? In the soil or in the consumers? I think you know this intuitively, right? Animals don't last that long, but you can calculate the typical number of years the carbon atom spends in the consumers by dividing 5 by 30. So let's talk about next. Well, actually, there's a couple more different definitions here. So aerobic, let's just get them written out. Aerobic, process that uses oxygen. An anaerobic, there's a process that doesn't. let's define consumers. Consumers are organisms, including animals, so it's not just the animals. That obtain chemical energy from photosynthesis, from photosynthesizers. Okay, so the primary producers do the work of producing the stuff, the carbohydrates that are high in energy, and those get used by the consumers. Let's talk a little bit more about photosynthesis. So this is the main process involved in primary productivity. And we take carbon dioxide plus water, or we don't, the primary producers do, and they produce, and I'll just use the simplest carbohydrate. Why don't I use the same thing we did before? Simple carbohydrate, or photosynthesis actually involves many different kinds of carbohydrates, and oxygen gas. Okay, so that's the chemical reaction that is going on with primary productivity. And then the sort of flip side of that, the respiration. So this is how this is what consumers are doing. So they're made out of this carbon that they've gotten from the primary producers, but they're also, most of the carbon that they interact with is breathed in and out. So we breathe in and out a lot more carbon than we actually have in our bodies over our lifetimes. So that process of respiration is basically the opposite of this photosynthesis process, which you would expect based on the arrows coming inflow and outflow of CO2 in the atmosphere. So for the respiration, we take the carbohydrate, eat it, breathe in some oxygen gas, and we produce CO2 and water. Okay? So we, as consumers, extract the energy that was originally captured from the sun through the photosynthesis process. We extract that energy by breathing, which we're sort of breathing and eating, right? Eating. That's another way to say what we just wrote out here as a chemical formula. And it's worth noting that plants do this too. So plants also gain metabolic energy by respiration. So when we draw this put this number on here of saying 60 gigatons per year, actually it's a little bit more than that, but the primary producers use some of that and then generate some of their own CO2, but it balances out as around 60. So the cells in the plants need to do the same things that the cells in our bodies do in terms of generating energy, and they use that carbohydrate that they've just made to do that. So something to notice here. Again, this is just the carbon cycle for terrestrial things. So just on the land, in the air above the land. So we'll continue to talk more about the other aspects of the carbon cycle, particularly in the oceans, next time. And we'll also cover the longer term carbon cycle. So you'll notice most of these numbers are pretty large amounts of carbon that's being transferred per year. And so if we're talking about the sort of the metamorphic situation with carbon, the carbon coming out of volcanoes, those rates are going to be a lot smaller. So for example, I talked about earlier how the soil and the sediments can turn into rocks. That process we didn't put it on here because it's more of a longer term cycle, but it's more in the order of like 0.1 gigatons per year of carbon is turned into some form of rock, which is very small compared to this, but it adds up over those long time scales and makes a big difference.